Your daughter has your eyes. When a Korean crime boss finally met the daughter he was never supposed to know about. On March 15th, 2015, in the quiet city of Namwon, a foreign journalist living under a discreet identity vanished only hours after noticing subtle signs that someone had entered her home without leaving any trace. Neighbors recall the unusual stillness that filled the hallway that night. The turning point came the next day, when a brief, whispered phone call exposed what no one had ever suspected. The child was not only hers, but also the daughter of a man whose world existed entirely in the shadows. To this day, people still wonder what truly unfolded during those final hours, and why certain details were never clarified. If you enjoy stories like this, follow the channel, like the video, and comment where you are watching from. The rain fell hard against the windows of the small Hanok-style house in Namwon, each drop echoing like a warning Janelle Ward had learned to ignore years ago. She sat at the low wooden table, her fingers trembling as she tried to focus on the article she was writing about traditional Korean pottery techniques, something safe, something that wouldn't draw attention. But her mind kept drifting to the sensation she couldn't shake, the feeling of being watched. Mira was sleeping in the next room, her 6-year-old body curled beneath a blanket decorated with characters from her favorite Korean animation. Janelle could hear her daughter's soft breathing through the thin walls, a sound that usually brought comfort, but tonight only amplified her anxiety. She glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m., too late for the neighborhood to be this quiet, yet too early for the usual sounds of dawn. Something was wrong. It started 3 days ago with small things. A neighbor she'd known for 2 years suddenly avoiding eye contact at the market. The Ajuma who ran the convenience store asking unusual questions about Mira's school schedule. Then yesterday, Janelle found her apartment door slightly ajar when she returned from picking up Mira. Just a centimeter, but enough. Nothing was stolen, nothing disturbed, yet everything felt violated. Tonight, the signs were unmistakable. She'd noticed a black sedan parked across the street for the past 4 hours, its engine occasionally rumbling to life, as if to remind her it was still there. The streetlight near her home had flickered and died exactly when she returned from putting out the trash. And most disturbing of all, when she checked Mira's school bag to prepare for tomorrow, she found a small origami crane she didn't remember her daughter making, folded with precision too perfect for a child's hands. Janelle's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood and moved silently through the house, checking windows, testing locks. The traditional wooden floors creaked beneath her feet despite her careful steps. In the kitchen, she noticed the kimchi container she'd left on the left side of the counter was now on the right. Someone had been inside. Recently. Yoma? Mira's small voice cut through the silence like a blade. Janelle rushed to her daughter's room, forcing her expression into something resembling calm. Mira sat up in bed, her eyes wide. Those distinctive eyes that Janelle had spent 6 years trying not to think about, trying not to see the reflection of someone else in them. "What's wrong, baby?" Janelle whispered, kneeling beside the bed and brushing her fingers through Mira's dark curls, a beautiful blend of her own heritage and something she'd tried to forget. "There were footsteps in the hallway," Mira said, her voice small, like someone walking really slowly. Janelle's blood turned to ice. She'd heard them too. "It's just the old house settling," she lied, pulling Mira close. "You know how these traditional homes are. They talk to us at night." But Mira wasn't convinced. At 6 years old, she'd already developed an unsettling ability to read her mother's fear. "Are we safe, Yama?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Janelle wanted to say yes, wanted to promise her daughter the protection she deserved, but the words caught in her throat. They weren't safe. They hadn't been safe for a while, and she'd been foolish to think she could hide forever in this quiet city, pretending to be just another foreign journalist who'd fallen in love with Korean culture. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," Janelle whispered, tucking the blanket around Mira's small frame. "I'm right here. I won't let anything happen to you." But as she returned to the main room, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She moved to the closet, pushed aside winter coats and storage boxes, and pulled out a small metal container she'd buried beneath old newspapers. Inside was a burner phone she'd sworn she would never use, a phone that represented everything she'd run from, everything she'd promised herself was over. The phone was old, a simple flip model from 7 years ago, but she knew it would still work. He would make sure it worked. That was the kind of man he was. Meticulous, controlling, always 3 steps ahead. Janelle's finger hovered over the power button. Turning on this phone meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that she couldn't protect Mira alone. It meant opening a door she'd locked with every ounce of strength she possessed. A sound outside made her decision for her. The unmistakable click of a car door closing. Footsteps approaching the house with purposeful intent. She pressed the button. The screen flickered to life with a soft glow. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number she'd memorized but never written down. The number that existed only in the dangerous corners of her memory. The phone rang once. Twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. Janelle opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her breath was ragged, her throat tight with 6 years of buried emotion. She couldn't do this. She couldn't. "I know it's you." The voice was exactly as she remembered. Deep, measured, carrying an authority that made powerful men nervous. "You're breathing?" I'd recognize it anywhere. Tears streamed down Janelle's face. Behind her, she heard Mira whimper in her sleep, a sound that pierced straight through her heart. There was a long pause. Then his voice changed, barely perceptible, but Janelle caught it. A crack in the armor she'd once known so well. "Janelle," Ryu Salmon said, his voice dropping to something almost vulnerable. "Why am I hearing the sound of our daughter crying?" The world stopped spinning. Our daughter. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Janelle's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the phone pressed against her ear like a lifeline. Outside, shadows moved past her window. Time was running out. Choices were collapsing. The life she'd built was already ashes. "I need you," she whispered, the words tasting like surrender and survival all at once. "They've found us. I don't know how, but they've found us." "I'm already on my way," Salmon replied, and she could hear movement on his end, doors opening, orders being given in rapid Korean. "Keep her close. Don't trust anyone who's approached you in the last month, do you understand?" "Yes." "Janelle," he said, his voice hardening into something dangerous, something that reminded her exactly who Ryu Salmon was in the shadows of Seoul. "No one touches what's mine. Not anymore." The line went dead. Janelle sat in the darkness of her home, clutching a phone that had just rewritten her entire future. In the next room, Mira had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep, unaware that her world was about to change forever, unaware that the father she'd never known was coming, and that some men, when they finally learn they have a daughter, will burn down everything standing between them and her. The penthouse suite in Gangnam stood silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of Ryu Salmon's fingers against the mahogany desk. Seoul's glittering skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a kingdom of light and shadow he'd spent 15 years building, controlling, dominating. Yet in this moment, surrounded by luxury that could buy silence and loyalty, he felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade: complete and utter loss of control. A daughter. He had a daughter. The words circled his mind like predators, refusing to settle into anything resembling logic. 6 years old. Mira. The name tasted foreign on his tongue, yet somehow achingly familiar. He'd spent the 20 minutes since Janelle's call sitting absolutely still, his body a statue while his mind rewrote every assumption he'd held about his life. Janelle Ward, the American journalist who'd walked into his world 7 years ago with questions that were too smart, eyes that saw too much, and a fearlessness that had both attracted and infuriated him. Their relationship had lasted 8 months, a dangerous, intoxicating collision of two people who understood power differently. She'd vanished without explanation, leaving only a note that said she couldn't live in his shadows. He'd respected that decision, told himself it was better this way, buried whatever feelings remained beneath layers of business and strategy. But she'd been pregnant, carrying his child, and she'd never told him. Salmon's jaw clenched as anger and something else, something uncomfortably close to hurt, warred inside his chest. Why hadn't she told him? What had she been so afraid of? But even as the questions formed, he knew the answers. She'd been afraid of him, of what he represented, of the world she'd glimpsed during those 8 months, a world where power meant something darker than she could accept. His phone buzzed. A message from Kim Junho, his head of security. "Ready when you are, Hyungnim. 3 vehicles, 12 men." Salmon's fingers hovered over the screen. 12 men. Enough to secure a perimeter, eliminate threats, make a statement. But something stopped him. Janelle had sounded terrified on that call. Yes, but she'd also sounded calculating. She'd waited until the last possible moment to contact him, which meant she'd been handling things alone for as long as she could. Showing up with a convoy would confirm every fear she had about who he was. He typed back, "Just you. 1 car, unmarked. We leave in 10 minutes. Young Nim, respectfully, that's not a discussion, Junho." Simon stood, moving to his private quarters to change. As he pulled on dark clothing, practical, unremarkable, his mind kept circling back to one detail from the phone call: our daughter. He'd said it instinctively, claiming something he'd never known existed. But the moment those words left his mouth, something had shifted fundamentally inside him. Mira wasn't just a child. She was his blood, his legacy, his responsibility. And someone was threatening her. His phone rang again, this time an internal number. Han Jung-gil, his senior advisor and the man who'd been with him since the beginning. Simon almost didn't answer, but Jung-gil rarely called at 1 a.m. without reason. "We have a situation," Jung-gil said without preamble. "Unusual activity on the Nam1 channels. Someone's asking questions about foreign residents, specifically journalists. They're being careful, but not careful enough." Simon's blood turned cold. "How long has this been happening?" 3 weeks. Maybe a month." There was a pause. "Simon, what's in Nam1?" "Everything." His entire world had just relocated to a small city he'd barely thought about in years. "Nothing that concerns the organization," Simon replied, his tone closing the subject. "I'm heading south tonight. Personal matter. Keep monitoring those channels, but don't act. I want to know who's asking and why." "You never take personal trips," Jung-gil said carefully. "If there's a problem, there isn't. Not one that involves you." Simon ended the call, but his mind was racing. 3 weeks of someone poking around Nam1, asking about foreign journalists. The timeline made his stomach twist. Had someone in his organization known about Janelle before tonight? Before he did? The thought was poison. Simon had built his network on loyalty and fear in equal measure, but he wasn't naive enough to believe everyone around him was incorruptible. Money talked. Secrets had value. And a child, his child, represented leverage that some might find too tempting to ignore. He grabbed a small duffel bag from his closet, packing with military efficiency. As his hands moved automatically, selecting items he might need, his thoughts drifted to the sound he'd heard on that phone call. A child crying. His daughter, frightened in the middle of the night, calling for her mother. Something cracked open inside his chest. A fissure in the armor he'd spent years constructing. He'd never thought about children, never planned for family. His life didn't leave room for such vulnerabilities. Yet hearing that small, scared voice in the background had triggered something primal, something that bypassed logic entirely. She had his blood, his protection, and by extension, his rage toward anyone who would dare threaten her. Juno was waiting in the underground garage, leaning against a modest Hyundai sedan that wouldn't draw attention on the highway. He looked at Simon with barely concealed concern. "Whatever this is, Hyungnim, I hope you know what you're doing." "I don't," Simon admitted, sliding into the passenger seat. "But that doesn't matter anymore." As they pulled onto the empty Seoul streets, heading toward the highway that would take them south to Nam1, Simon pulled out his phone and typed a message to Janelle. 4 hours. Stay inside. Lock everything. If anyone knocks before I arrive, don't answer." Her response came immediately. "Okay." Then, after a pause, "Simon, I'm sorry. For everything." He stared at the message for a long moment, watching Seoul's lights blur past the window. Sorry for leaving? Sorry for not telling him? Sorry for bringing him into something dangerous? It didn't matter. None of the past mattered anymore. He typed back, "We'll talk when I get there. Keep her safe until then." But what he wanted to say, what he couldn't quite form into words, was simpler and more terrifying. "I have a daughter, and I don't know how to be a father, but I know how to destroy anyone who threatens what's mine." And in 4 hours, Nam1 would learn exactly what that meant. The Gwangju bus terminal bustled with the controlled chaos of early morning travelers, students heading to universities, businessmen clutching coffee cups, elderly women balancing bags of fresh produce from the market. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh, clinical glow that made Janelle's exhaustion feel even more pronounced. She sat on a plastic bench in the waiting area, Mira pressed against her side, her daughter's small hand gripping her jacket like a lifeline. They'd left Nam1 3 hours ago, slipping out before dawn in a taxi Janelle had called from 2 districts away. The driver had given her strange looks when she'd paid him extra to take indirect routes, but he'd accepted the money without questions. The universal language of don't ask, don't tell. Now, surrounded by dozens of strangers, Janelle felt both safer and more exposed than she had in her empty house. Seaman's last message had been clear. Gwangju Terminal, Section C, 6 a.m. Come alone. It was 5:47 a.m. 13 minutes until she saw him again. 13 minutes until her carefully constructed life collided with the past she'd spent 6 years running from. Mira shifted beside her, tilting her head up with those impossibly perceptive eyes. "Yama, why are your hands shaking?" Janelle looked down and realized her daughter was right. Her fingers trembled against her lap despite her best efforts to appear calm. "Just tired, baby," she lied, smoothing down Mira's curls. "We didn't sleep much last night." "Is the man we're meeting scary?" Mira asked, her voice carrying that peculiar blend of curiosity and wisdom that sometimes made Janelle forget her daughter was only 6. The question hit harder than it should have. Was Seaman scary? Yes, absolutely, but not in the way most people feared things. He was scary in the way earthquakes were scary, a force of nature that could reshape entire landscapes, indifferent to whatever stood in its path. Yet with her, 7 years ago, he'd been something else entirely. Intense, yes. Controlling, often. But never cruel. Never careless with her heart. Even when she'd wished he would be because it might have made leaving easier. Janelle struggled for words that would make sense to a 6-year-old. He's someone who keeps people safe. Someone who's very good at protecting what matters to him. Like a policeman? Janelle almost laughed at the irony. Something like that. But her attempt at reassurance evaporated when she noticed a man in a gray suit lingering near the convenience store, his eyes tracking them with too much focus. Then another, a woman with a red scarf, pretending to read a departure schedule but glancing their way every few seconds. Janelle's journalist instincts, honed by years of investigating stories people wanted buried, screamed warnings. They weren't alone. Someone was watching. Her phone buzzed. "I see them too. Stay calm. 2 minutes." Janelle's heart hammered against her ribs. How did Seaman know? Where was he? She scanned the terminal frantically, searching for him among the crowd, but saw nothing except ordinary travelers and those 2 observers who were trying far too hard to blend in. Mira tugged at her sleeve. "Iyama, that Ayusi keeps looking at us. Don't look back at him, sweetheart," Janelle whispered, pulling Mira closer. "Just stay next to me, okay?" The terminal's PA system crackled with announcements in Korean. Departures, arrivals, platform changes. The noise should have been comforting, a blanket of normalcy, but instead it felt suffocating. Janelle stood, gripping Mira's hand, ready to move if those watchers took a single step closer. Then she saw him. Ryu Seaman walked through the terminal entrance like he owned it. No entourage, no security detail. Just one man in dark clothing that somehow made him look more dangerous than if he'd been surrounded by guards. His hair was shorter than she remembered, streaked with hints of gray at the temples that hadn't been there 7 years ago. His face remained as sharp and unreadable as ever, the kind of face that gave nothing away unless he wanted it to. But when his eyes found hers across the crowded terminal, something flickered in his expression, something that looked almost like relief. He moved toward them with purposeful strides, and Janelle felt time collapse. 7 years dissolved into nothing. She was suddenly 28 again, standing in a soul bar, meeting the eyes of a man who would unravel every certainty she'd ever had about herself. Then his gaze dropped to Mira, and everything stopped. Seaman froze 3 steps away, staring at the little girl who clutched her mother's hand. Janelle watched emotions cascade across his face in rapid succession. Shock, recognition, something that looked almost like pain. She knew what he was seeing. The eyes. Mira had inherited his exact eyes, dark, intense, carrying a depth that seemed impossible for a child. Mira, oblivious to the weight of the moment, studied him with open curiosity. "Are you the man who protects people?" she asked in careful Korean, her accent carrying traces of both languages she'd grown up speaking. Seaman's throat worked visibly. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than Janelle remembered. "Yes, I am." "You look like me," Mira observed with the blunt honesty only children possessed. "We have the same eyes." Something cracked in Seaman's carefully maintained composure. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Mira's eye level. "We do," he said quietly. "That's because we're family." The terminal seemed to fade away. The announcements, the travelers, the watchers who were still tracking their every move. In that moment, there was only a father meeting his daughter for the first time, both of them recognizing something fundamental in each other. Mira tilted her head, considering this information seriously. Then she smiled, a small, tentative expression that transformed her face. "I always wanted family," she said. "It's just been me and Iyama." Janelle's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment. In the rare times she'd let herself imagine it at all, she'd pictured anger, accusations, demands. Not this quiet recognition, this gentle acknowledgement of a truth that had existed for 6 years in secret. Seaman stood, his eyes meeting Janelle's over Mira's head. In that gaze she saw questions, hurt, and something harder. A promise, perhaps, or a warning. But before either of them could speak, his expression shifted sharply. He'd noticed what Janelle had seen earlier, the Watchers, now moving closer with coordinated precision. "We need to leave," Seaman said, his voice dropping into command mode. "Now." He reached for Mira's other hand, and the little girl accepted it without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to hold her father's hand. They moved as a unit toward the east exit, Seaman's body positioning itself protectively between them and the approaching figures. As they walked, Seaman leaned close to Janelle and whispered words that sent ice through her veins. "Don't trust anyone who's approached you in the last month, especially anyone who claimed they wanted to help you." The guest house sat tucked away on a quiet street in Namwon's older district, the kind of place tourists passed without noticing, a traditional hanok with weathered wooden beams and paper-screen doors that whispered with every breath of wind. Seaman had chosen it deliberately, somewhere small enough to be overlooked, but established enough that sudden guests wouldn't raise questions. The elderly owner, a woman who'd asked no questions when Seaman paid her in cash for 3 nights, had simply bowed and handed him the keys. Now, as afternoon light filtered through the Hanji windows, Janelle sat cross-legged on the heated floor, watching Mira sleep on a pile of blankets in the corner. The journey from Gwangju had exhausted her daughter completely. The fear, the confusion, the strange man who was suddenly part of their lives. Mira had fallen asleep holding Janelle's hand, her small face finally peaceful after hours of tension. Seaman stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the daylight, watching the street with the vigilance of someone who'd spent years expecting danger. They hadn't spoken much since arriving. The weight of 6 years sat between them like a living thing, too massive to address directly. Janelle broke the silence first. "You said not to trust anyone who approached me in the last month." Seaman didn't turn from the window. "Yes." "Kim Rae-won," Janelle said, the name tasting bitter. "He moved to Namwon 5 weeks ago. Said he was opening a photography studio. We knew each other briefly in Seoul, years back. So when he recognized me at the market, it seemed natural, coincidental." "There are no coincidences in my world," Seaman replied, his voice flat. What did he want to know? Janelle's stomach twisted as she replayed their conversations. About Mira, her schedule, her school, whether her father was in the picture. She paused, feeling foolish. "I thought he was just being friendly, maybe interested in me." Seaman's jaw clenched visibly. He was gathering information, building a profile. For who? But even as Janelle asked, dread pooled in her gut. She knew the answer, or at least part of it. Someone in Seaman's organization, someone close enough to know his past, to connect dots that should have remained scattered. Before Seaman could respond, Janelle's attention caught on her laptop bag, still packed from their hasty departure. "Wait," she said, moving quickly to retrieve it. "There's something else. I found these last week." She pulled out a folder of documents she'd discovered while researching a story about international adoption agencies in Korea. Buried in public records, she'd found financial transactions that made her journalist instincts flare. Wire transfers from companies she recognized from her time with Seaman, payments flowing into organizations that operated in legal gray zones. "These are from your network," Janelle said, spreading the papers across the floor. Money moving through shell corporations into agencies that were shut down for irregularities. "Seaman, some of these transactions happened while we were together." He finally turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "I know." "You know?" Janelle's voice rose before she caught herself, glancing at sleeping Mira. "You knew your money was being used for—" "I didn't authorize those transfers," Seaman interrupted, his tone sharp. "I learned about them 3 years ago during an internal audit. By then the damage was done. I shut down the accounts, removed the people responsible, but not before lives were affected, Janelle said quietly. Not before families were separated, children displaced. Samon's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or regret. No, not before that. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Janelle had always known Samon's world operated in shadows, that his power came with compromises she couldn't accept. But seeing evidence, holding proof of the consequences in her hands, made it visceral in a way abstract knowledge never had. Is that why someone's tracking us? She asked. Something to do with this? Possibly. Samon moved to sit across from her, his movements controlled. Or it could be someone who sees Mira as leverage against me, or someone who simply wants to cause damage because they can. He paused. In my world, Janelle, there are always multiple threats running simultaneously. A soft knock on the door made them both freeze. Samon's hand moved instinctively to his waist, where Janelle glimpsed the outline of something she didn't want to think about. He approached the door silently, peering through the small gap. It's the owner, he said, relaxing marginally, with food. But when he opened the door, the elderly woman's expression was strange, apologetic and frightened at once. She set down a tray of banchan and rice, then leaned close to Samon and whispered something in rapid Korean. Janelle caught only fragments. Man asking questions, showed a photo, said he was family. Samon's entire body went rigid. He thanked the woman quietly, closed the door, and turned to Janelle with an expression that made her blood run cold. We need to leave, he said. Soon. Someone showed the owner a photograph and asked if she'd seen you. What kind of photograph? One of Mira, Samon replied. From her school. The implication struck Janelle like a physical blow. Someone had accessed Mira's school records, obtained recent photos, and was now canvassing the area systematically. This wasn't casual surveillance. This was a coordinated search. She moved to wake Mira, but Samon stopped her. Let her sleep another hour. We'll move after dark. He pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. I'm having Junho run background on everyone who's entered Namwon in the last 2 months. We'll find out who's orchestrating this. Janelle nodded, but her mind was spinning. She walked to her bag and pulled out Mira's school backpack, intending to repack it more efficiently. As she unzipped the front pocket, something fell out. A small envelope, cream-colored and sealed, that definitely hadn't been there before. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Samon. He was beside her instantly. Together, they stared at the envelope, neither wanting to open it, but both knowing they had to. Samon took it carefully, broke the seal, and pulled out a single card with handwritten text in Korean. The blood drained from his face as he read it. Janelle watched his knuckles turn white around the paper. What does it say? Samon's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. She shouldn't have been born. The words hung in the air like poison. Someone hadn't just found them. Someone had been close enough to slip a message into Mira's bag, close enough to touch her belongings, close enough to threaten without being seen. Janelle looked at her sleeping daughter, curled peacefully in blankets, unaware that someone wanted to erase her existence. Rage and terror warred inside her chest, but above both emotions rose a crystal-clear certainty. She would die before letting anyone harm Mira. She met Samon's eyes and saw the same promise reflected back, a father's fury, barely contained, waiting for a target. Find them, Janelle said quietly. Find whoever wrote this. Samon's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. I already am. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m., pulling Samon from the shallow sleep he'd allowed himself while keeping watch. Han Jong-gil's name illuminated the screen. His oldest advisor, the man who'd stood beside him through territorial wars and political maneuvering, whose loyalty Samon had never questioned until this precise moment. We need to talk, Jong-gil said without preamble, his voice carrying that peculiar tightness that meant trouble. Face to face. There are things you need to know about Namwon. Samon glanced across the darkened room where Janelle slept fitfully on one mat. Mira curled against her side. I'm not in Seoul. I know where you are, Samona. The familiarity in Jong-gil's tone felt wrong somehow, too casual for the circumstances. That's why we need to talk. You're making decisions based on incomplete information. Then complete it. A pause. Not over the phone. Meet me at the old distillery outside Namwon, the one we used for the Lee negotiation 3 years ago. 1 hour. The line went dead before Samon could respond. He stared at the phone, his mind processing the conversation's subtext. Jungle knew he was in Namwon, not surprising given his position, but the certainty in his voice suggested he'd known for a while, and that reference to incomplete information felt calculated, designed to make Semin question everything he thought he understood. He stood quietly, moving to the window to check the street. Empty, as it had been for the past 3 hours. But emptiness didn't mean safety. It often meant the opposite. He typed a message to Junho. Background check on Han Jongil. Everything. Financial, communications, movements for the last 6 months. The response came quickly. Hyungnim, Jongil-si has been with us since... I know how long he's been with us. Do it anyway. Saemin pulled on his jacket, checking the weapon concealed at his waist. A precaution he'd hoped wouldn't be necessary, but increasingly felt inevitable. As he moved toward the door, a small voice stopped him. You're leaving? Mira sat up, her eyes reflecting moonlight from the window. For a child who'd been sleeping moments ago, she looked remarkably alert. Just for a little while, Saemin said, crouching beside her. The gesture still felt unfamiliar, this instinct to reassure, to gentle his voice for a child's ears. I'll be back before you wake up. That's what people say before they don't come back, Mira observed with unsettling wisdom. In the stories Iyama tells me, the statement hit harder than it should have. Saemin found himself studying his daughter's face, so like his own in bone structure, but carrying Janelle's expressiveness, her ability to see through pretense. I promise, he said, and realized he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. I will come back. Mira considered this seriously, then nodded. Okay, but if you don't, I'll be very disappointed in you. Something cracked open in Saemin's chest, a feeling he couldn't name, equal parts pain and strange joy. I'll keep that in mind, he said softly. The drive to the old distillery took 20 minutes through empty rural roads. The building loomed against the night sky, abandoned years ago when industrial production moved to larger facilities. Saemin had used it once for a negotiation that required discretion, neutral ground where neither party felt exposed. Jongil's car was already there, parked in shadows. Saemin approached cautiously, his hand resting near his weapon. The older man stepped out, alone as promised, but his body language was wrong, too tense, too defensive. You look tired, Saemina, Jongil said, attempting warmth that didn't reach his eyes. This situation must be weighing on you. What situation would that be? Saemin kept his distance, measuring the space between them. Jongil sighed, leaning against his car. The woman, the child. You're making this complicated when it doesn't need to be. Explain that. Leaves that complicate business have a way of simplifying themselves, Jongil said carefully, each word chosen with precision. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let nature take its course. Remove variables that create vulnerability. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Saemin's voice, when he spoke, carried the edge that made powerful men nervous. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting you consider the bigger picture, Jongil replied, his mask slipping slightly. You've built an empire on making difficult choices. This is just another one. She's my daughter. She's a liability. Jongil's voice hardened. A weakness your enemies will exploit. The woman already left you once. What makes you think she won't use the child against you now? Take what leverage you can, handle the situation cleanly, and move forward. Saemin felt something crystallize inside him, a clarity that cut through years of complicated loyalty. How long have you known about Janelle? Jongil's hesitation was answer enough. Does it matter? How long? 3 years, Jongil admitted. We tracked her when she resurfaced doing journalism in Busan. Ran background, discovered the child, did the math. I kept it quiet, waiting to see if it would become relevant. And you decided it's relevant now. You're different since that phone call, Jongil said. Distracted, making emotional decisions. This is exactly what I warned you about years ago. Personal attachments create exploitable weaknesses. Saemin's phone buzzed. A message from Junho that made his blood run cold. Financial records showing Jongil had received 3 large payments from an offshore account in the last month. Communications logs revealing calls to Namwon numbers, including one to Kim Raewon's photography studio. You sent Raewon, Saemin said quietly, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You've been orchestrating this entire situation. Jongil's expression shifted into something colder, more calculating. I've been protecting you from yourself. That woman and her child represent everything that could destroy what we've built. I was giving you an easy solution. Let them disappear quietly, compensate her generously, and move on. An easy solution. Samon's voice was deadly calm. You put a message in my daughter's bag. She shouldn't have been born. Psychological pressure. Make the woman scared enough. She'd leave on her own. Clean, simple. No one gets hurt. Except you miscalculated, Samon said, pulling his phone out. You assumed I'd choose the Empire over them. You were wrong. Jongle straightened, his hand moving toward his jacket. Samona, don't make this a problem. But Samon was already calling Junho, his eyes never leaving Jongil. Track Jongil's vehicle. Freeze his accounts. I want a full audit of every decision he's made in the last 3 years. You're making a mistake, Jongle said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Everything I've done has been for your protection. No, Samon replied, and in that moment he felt the weight of every choice he'd made, every compromise, every time he'd chosen power over humanity. You've been protecting your vision of who I should be, but I'm choosing something different now. His phone buzzed again, an incoming message with an attached audio file. Samon's blood turned to ice as he recognized Jongil's voice on the recording. The mother, or the child, one doesn't come back. Dawn broke over Namwan with the kind of cruel beauty that made everything seem peaceful, soft light filtering through morning mist, the distant sound of temple bells marking the start of another day. Janelle sat at the low table in the guest house, surrounded by documents she'd spent the night organizing, her laptop screen casting a pale glow across her exhausted face. She hadn't slept since Samon left 4 hours ago, using the time instead to do what she did best. Investigate, connect dots, find the truth buried beneath layers of careful deception. What she'd found made her stomach turn. The door opened quietly, and Samon entered, looking like he'd aged a decade in a single night. His clothes were disheveled, his expression carrying a weight that went beyond simple fatigue. He stopped when he saw her surrounded by papers, and something flickered across his face. Resignation, perhaps, or recognition that a reckoning was coming. You should be sleeping, he said, his voice rough. I found something, Janelle replied, not bothering with pleasantries. She pushed a stack of printed pages across the table. Financial records from 2018. Your organization funded operations in Southeast Asia. Operations that displaced families, separated children from parents. The same year, you and I were together. Samon looked at the documents but didn't pick them up. I told you. I didn't authorize. I know what you told me, Janelle interrupted, her journalist's instinct for evasion flaring. But these transactions have authorization codes linked directly to your corporate structure. Even if you didn't sign off personally, they happened under your authority, with your resources, in your name. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. Mira still slept in the corner, her soft breathing the only sound besides the rustling of papers as morning wind slipped through gaps in the wooden walls. You're right, Samon finally said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. They happened in my name, on my watch. I was building an empire and didn't look closely enough at the foundation it was built on. People suffered, Janelle said quietly. Families were destroyed. Yes, the single word hung in the air, unadorned by excuse or justification. Janelle had expected defensiveness, rationalization, the kind of strategic deflection powerful men used when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Instead, Samon's acceptance felt almost worse, an acknowledgement that he'd known, on some level, that his power came with a price paid by others. Is that why you let me go 7 years ago? Janelle asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Because you knew I'd eventually find this? That I'd never be able to reconcile who you were with who I needed you to be? Samon's jaw tightened. I let you go because you asked to leave. Because you looked at me one day and I saw fear in your eyes. And I realized keeping you would destroy something in you that He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally. That I couldn't bear to destroy. The confession landed between them like something fragile and dangerous. Janelle felt tears threatening but pushed them back, refusing to let sentiment override the questions that needed asking. A knock at the door interrupted them. Samon moved instantly into protective mode, positioning himself between the door and Mira's sleeping form. But it was only the guest house owner again, this time accompanied by a man Janelle recognized. Kim Raewon, the photographer who'd befriended her weeks ago, whose presence in Namwan suddenly made terrible sense. I'm sorry, the elderly woman said, her voice shaking. He said he just wanted to talk. He said it was important. Raywin stepped forward, his expression apologetic, but his eyes carrying something harder. Calculation, perhaps, or desperation. Janelle, I need you to listen to me. You're in danger, and it's not from who you think. Get out, Salmon said, his voice carrying lethal calm. She deserves to know the truth, Raywin continued, ignoring Seaman entirely. About who's really behind this. About what happened to your investigation 7 years ago. Janelle's blood ran cold. What investigation? The one you were working on when you met him, Raywin said, gesturing at Seaman. The expose on illegal operations in Southeast Asia. You dropped it suddenly, disappeared from Seoul, and everyone assumed it was because you'd fallen for someone powerful enough to make you stop asking questions. The room seemed to tilt. Janelle had told herself that leaving Seoul, abandoning that investigation, had been her choice. A decision made because she was pregnant, scared, and unwilling to bring a child into the dangerous world she'd been documenting. But Raywin's words suggested something darker. I never told anyone about that investigation, Janelle said slowly, except my editor, and he died in a car accident 6 months after I left Seoul. Accident, Raywin repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. Just like it was an accident that your source in Bangkok disappeared. Just like it was an accident that every lead you had suddenly went cold. Janelle turned to Seaman, searching his face for denial, for shock, for anything that would contradict what Raywin was implying. But what she saw instead made her breath catch, a terrible, guilty knowledge in his eyes. Seaman, she whispered, her voice breaking. Did you know about my investigation when we met? The pause before he answered told her everything. Yes. The single word shattered something inside her. Did you approach me because of it? Initially, Salmon admitted, and each word seemed dragged from somewhere deep and painful. You were getting too close to operations that would have exposed people I was connected to. I was sent to assess the threat, to determine how much you knew. And then what? Janelle felt like she was falling, every certainty she'd built dissolving beneath her. You decided to seduce me instead? Make me fall in love with you so I'd stop digging? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Her voice rose, trembling with rage and betrayal. Tell me, Simon, when exactly did I stop being a problem to manage and start being a person you actually cared about? Mira stirred in the corner, mumbling in her sleep, and both adults froze. The little girl settled back into quiet breathing, unaware that her entire origin story was being rewritten in real time. Simon's voice, when he spoke again, was barely audible. The night you told me about your childhood, about losing your parents, about being alone, that was the first time I saw you as more than an obstacle. He paused, his composure cracking, and by then, I was already in too deep to walk away. But you knew, Janelle said, tears finally spilling over. You knew I was pregnant when I left, didn't you? That's why you didn't follow, why you let me go so easily. The question hung in the air, loaded with 6 years of assumptions and hurt. Raywin watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. The guest house owner had fled, leaving them alone with truths too heavy to bear. Janelle, Seaman started, but couldn't finish. She stood abruptly, her hands shaking. Did you? No? The answer to Janelle's question came not from Seaman's words, but from his silence. A heavy, suffocating quiet that filled the guest house like smoke. She watched emotions war across his face, that carefully controlled mask finally crumbling to reveal something raw and devastated beneath. I suspected, Seaman finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. You were sick every morning those last 2 weeks. You stopped drinking coffee. You kept touching your stomach without realizing it. He paused, his hands clenching at his sides. But I told myself I was wrong, that if you were pregnant you would have told me. So you let me leave, Janelle said, her voice hollow. Knowing I might be carrying your child, you just let me walk away. Because you were terrified of me. The words burst from Seaman with unexpected force. You flinched when I entered rooms. You stopped sleeping. I saw what being in my world was doing to you. And I knew, his voice cracked. I knew that keeping you would destroy you. So yes, I let you go. I thought it was the right thing. The right thing? Janelle's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. The right thing would have been honesty. The right thing would have been giving me a choice instead of making decisions about my life, about our child's life, without me. Raywin cleared his throat from the doorway, reminding them of his presence. This is touching, truly, but we have a more immediate problem. Han Jung-gil isn't working alone. He's been in contact with people from your past, Janelle. People who want that investigation buried permanently. What are you talking about? Janelle turned on him, her patience fraying completely. And who are you really? Because I'm starting to doubt you're actually a photographer. Raywin's expression shifted into something harder, more professional. I was sent by someone who has an interest in seeing certain operations exposed. Someone who believes the truth about what happened 7 years ago needs to come out. Sent by who? Saman demanded, his body tense with barely controlled aggression. Does it matter? Raywin countered. What matters is that Jung-gil has been planning something for weeks. Something that involves making both Janelle and the child disappear quietly. And he's not the only one with that agenda. A soft voice interrupted them. Why does everyone keep saying I need to disappear? All 3 adults froze. Mira stood in the corner, clutching her blanket, her eyes wide and frightened, but also carrying that unsettling perception that made her seem far older than 6. She'd been awake, listening to everything, the accusations, the revelations, the terrible truths about her origins. Janelle moved to her daughter instantly, kneeling down and pulling Mira into her arms. Baby, you don't need to worry about— I'm not a baby, Mira said, her voice trembling but firm. And I want to know why people think I shouldn't exist. Is it because of him? She pointed at Simon. Because he's my father? The word, father, hung in the air like something fragile and precious. It was the first time Mira had said it directly, acknowledging the connection they'd been dancing around since the terminal in Gwangju. Semin's expression shattered completely. He moved toward them slowly, as if approaching something that might vanish if he moved too quickly. Mira, he said, and his voice carried a gentleness Janelle had never heard from him before. None of this is your fault. You're perfect. He stopped, struggling with emotions he clearly had no practice expressing. You're the best thing I never knew I had. Then why won't you answer Yama's question? Mira asked with devastating simplicity. Did you know about me before? The child's directness cut through all adult pretense. Saman knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level the way he had at the terminal. I didn't know for certain, he said carefully, but I should have asked. I should have fought harder to keep your mother safe, to keep both of you safe, and I'm sorry I didn't. Mira studied him with those eyes that were mirror images of his own, dark, intense, seeing too much. Then she did something that broke both adults completely. She reached out and touched Saman's face, her small hand tracing the line of his jaw. You have sad eyes, she observed quietly. Just like mine when Iyama tells me we can't go home. Tears tracked silently down Semin's face, the first time Janelle had ever seen him cry. We'll find you a home, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. Somewhere safe, somewhere no one can hurt you. I don't want somewhere safe, Mira said, her child's logic cutting through complexity. I want us to be together, all of us, like a real family. The innocence of the wish was almost unbearable. Janelle felt her own tears flowing freely now, 6 years of fear and loneliness and desperate hope colliding in her chest. She looked at Saman across their daughter's small form and saw her own devastation reflected back. Raywin's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He checked it, and his expression darkened. We need to move. Now. Jongel's people are mobilizing. They know you're here. How many? Semin was on his feet instantly, his protective instincts overriding everything else. Enough. Raywin moved to the window, peering through the curtains. And they're not interested in talking anymore. Saman pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Junho's 15 minutes out with backup. We just need to hold position until— The window exploded inward with a crash that sent glass scattering across the floor. Janelle grabbed Mira, shielding her daughter's body with her own, as Saman and Raywin both drew weapons from concealed holsters. Outside, car doors slammed. Footsteps approached with military precision. Back room, Saman ordered, his voice shifting into command mode. Both of you. Now. But Janelle had spent too many years in conflict zones to freeze under pressure. There's no back exit in these old Hanoks. We're trapped. Another window shattered, followed by a voice calling from outside in Korean. Ryu Saman. We don't want trouble. Just send out the woman and child, and everyone walks away. Saman's expression turned absolutely feral. Not happening. Then we do this the difficult way. the voice responded, and something small and cylindrical arced through the broken window, hitting the floor with a metallic clang. Time seemed to slow. Janelle saw Simon's eyes widen in recognition, saw him move faster than she thought possible, grabbing both her and Mira and diving toward the interior room. Felt the concussive force of the explosion even through walls, heard Mira's scream mixing with her own. When the ringing in her ears subsided enough to hear, Mira was sobbing against her chest, and Simon was covering both of them with his body, blood trickling from a cut above his eye where debris had struck him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking them both for injuries. "We're okay," Janelle managed, though her voice shook badly. "Mira, baby, are you—" "I'm scared," Mira cried, her small body trembling violently. "Iama, I'm so scared." Simon's face transformed into something Janelle recognized from 7 years ago. The cold, calculating fury of a man who'd built an empire on knowing exactly how to destroy his enemies. 3 months later, Namwon had returned to its quiet rhythm, the kind of peaceful normalcy that felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. The cherry blossoms were blooming along Gwanghalu Garden, their petals drifting through the air like pink snow, and the morning markets bustled with ajumas haggling over vegetables and fresh fish. Janelle sat on the porch of a different house now, a small but comfortable place on the outskirts of town, far from the guest house that had been destroyed that terrible night. She watched Mira play in the yard, drawing pictures with colored chalk on the stone pathway, her daughter's laughter a sound that still felt miraculous after weeks of nightmares and fear. The aftermath had been brutal and swift. Simon had kept his promise. No one touched what was his. Jong-gil and his associates had been systematically removed from power, their operations dismantled, their threats neutralized. But the cost had been equally severe. Simon had been forced to expose parts of his organization to legal scrutiny, to accept accountability for operations that bore his name, even when he hadn't directly authorized them. The legal proceedings were still ongoing in Seoul. Financial crimes, conspiracy, enabling operations that had harmed vulnerable people. Simon's lawyers insisted he'd avoid prison. His cooperation had been substantial, his position too valuable to certain political interests. But his empire was finished, fractured beyond repair by the very transparency he'd been forced to embrace. Janelle had written the story, all of it. The investigation from 7 years ago, the operations that had displaced families, the web of power and corruption that stretched across borders. It had been published in 3 major international outlets, and the response had been seismic. Government investigations, international pressure, promises of reform. Some people called her brave. Others called her a traitor for exposing the father of her child. Janelle called it necessary, the only way to break the cycle, to ensure Mira grew up in a world where truth mattered more than power. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see Raewon approaching, a folder tucked under his arm. He'd turned out to be exactly what he'd claimed, a journalist himself, working undercover for an international investigation. They'd formed an unlikely partnership over the past months, collaborating on stories that picked up where Janelle's original investigation had ended. "The final piece just went live," Raewon said, settling onto the porch steps. "The one about the reformed adoption protocols. Your name's on it, as lead investigator." Janelle nodded, feeling the weight of what they'd accomplished. Lives changed, systems reformed, justice, imperfect but real, finally served. "Any blowback?" "Always, but nothing we can't handle." Raewon glanced at Mira, who was now singing to herself in Korean, while drawing what appeared to be a rainbow. "How is she?" "Better," Janelle said softly. "The nightmares are less frequent. She's starting to trust that we're safe." She paused. "She asks about him sometimes." "Does he know?" "I send updates. Through his lawyer." Janelle looked down at her hands. "He doesn't respond, but I know he reads them." The agreement had been clear. Simon would stay away until all legal proceedings concluded, until he could prove he'd fundamentally changed the trajectory of his life. Janelle had needed that distance, that guarantee that Mira wouldn't grow up shadowed by the world her father had built, but she'd also made sure Mira knew the truth. Not the sanitized version, but the real, complicated story. A father who'd made terrible choices, who'd hurt people through negligence and ambition, but who'd also chosen to sacrifice everything when it mattered most. A father who was trying, imperfectly, to become someone worthy of his daughter's love. "There's something you should see," Raewon said, pulling an envelope from his folder. It arrived at the newspaper this morning, addressed to Mira Ward. Janelle's heart clenched as she recognized the handwriting. She took the envelope carefully, noting how light it felt. Not a letter, then. Something else. Inside was a single card, the kind children use for drawing. On it, rendered in simple but careful strokes, was a picture. 3 figures holding hands. A woman with curly hair. A small girl with bright eyes. A man standing slightly apart but connected, his hand reaching toward the others. All 3 figures had the same eyes. Distinctive, intense, unmistakably belonging to each other. Janelle's vision blurred with tears. It wasn't an apology. Seaman was too honest for empty gestures. It wasn't a promise, because they both knew some things couldn't be promised. It was simply an acknowledgement. We are connected, whether together or apart, by something that transcends every mistake, every fear, every choice that brought us here. Iama, Mira had abandoned her chalk drawings and climbed onto the porch, her small face curious. "Why are you crying?" Janelle wiped her eyes, then showed her daughter the picture. Mira studied it seriously, her finger tracing the drawn figures. "That's us," Mira said quietly. "All of us. Yes, baby. That's us. Will he come back someday?" The question was small, hopeful, breaking Janelle's heart in the way only children's honesty could. Janelle thought about Seaman in Seoul, facing consequences that would reshape his entire existence. About the man who'd let her go once because he loved her too much to destroy her, and who was now staying away for the same reason. About the long road toward redemption, and whether it was possible for someone to truly change after living so long in darkness. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I know he thinks about you. I know he wishes things were different, and I know that wherever he is, whatever he's doing, you matter to him more than anything else in the world." Mira nodded, accepting this with the resilience children somehow manage. "Can I keep the picture?" "Of course." As her daughter returned to playing, now incorporating the new drawing into her chalk masterpiece, Janelle sat with the weight of everything they'd survived. The fear, the betrayal, the violence that had nearly destroyed them, but also the truth finally told, the systems finally challenged, the beginning, however imperfect, of something like justice. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for the updates. Please keep sending them. She deserves to know her father is trying to become someone worthy of being known. S." Janelle typed back carefully. "She already knows. And someday, when you've finished what you need to finish, there might be room for more than pictures." The response came quickly. "I hope so. More than anything." In the garden, Mira had drawn 3 stick figures holding hands, mirroring the card. But in her version, all 3 figures were smiling, standing in front of a house with flowers and a rainbow overhead, a child's vision of what family could be, untainted by adult complexity. Janelle watched her daughter create hope from broken pieces, and for the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, somehow, impossible things could still come true. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, when all the hard work of change had been done, when accountability had been faced, and growth had been genuine. Someday, the 3 figures in Mira's drawing might become real, and until then, they would survive, and heal, and build a life worth living in the light. In the end, this was never just a story about hidden identities or a past that refused to stay buried. It was a story about the quiet courage required to protect what we love, even when every choice feels impossible. A story about how a single revelation can reshape a lifetime, and how the heart often knows the truth long before the mind is ready to accept it. When Janelle held her daughter close in those final moments of uncertainty, she taught us something profound, that even in the shadows, love insists on finding its way forward. But now the question turns to you. If you were the one forced to choose between safety and truth, comfort and conscience, would you have stepped into the unknown the way she did? If you discovered that someone from your past carried a truth capable of redefining everything you believed, would you face them or walk away? Stories like this linger because they echo the decisions we fear most, the ones that reveal who we really are. As the final image fades, let this remain with you. Sometimes the most powerful transformations do not come from triumph or justice, but from the fragile, trembling decision to keep going, to trust again, to open the door to a future that terrifies you. And perhaps that is the real lesson here. Not the fall of an empire, but the rise of a heart that refuses to stop trying.